Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Well, hello. Here we are again in this little warm, cosy, friendly corner of the internet that I like to call the Australian bar. Welcome. Ooh, see, there's a box on the bar. It's a Lafroig Isla Malt. For those who know their whiskies, it's a particularly peaty one. And Mrs. Craig bought a bottle. I think it's a treat to herself. And we may have had a few last night whilst watching the season finale of Alien Earth, their little insight into our domestic life here in Strawberry Hill. And yes, other fine Isla malts are also available. But yeah, welcome. Has it been 2 weeks? Gosh, a lot has happened in our world and in the world of this podcast and in the life of Phil Craig. Now, I've been encouraged by some of you saying that you quite like my introductory monologues / rants / insights into my life. So I'm going to give you some more of those. And I might even read a bit more from my book, which is sitting over there somewhere. But of course, as ever, if what you're interested in is the actual subject of this program, you can scroll ahead. It's dead easy. Just move the cursor. Come on, guys. You can work this out. And if you do that, you will scroll ahead to my interview, which is really interesting, actually. A really fun interview with Steve Tibble. All of the people I've met through this podcast, who I've actually become friends with in real life. But we're planning to have a pre-Christmas drink together fairly soon, which would be nice. A lovely bloke, very good writer, fun book. I think I call it Medieval History by Tarantino. So it's quite violent, and it's got lots of kind of dark conspiracies. Yeah, Assassins, the Templars, what's not to love? Anyway, things I need to say. Where to start, of course, with the comments. Yeah, last week's show. Thank you. Wow. I think I'm up to nearly 13,000 views on YouTube, many thousands more on audio. This is a good result for Phil. This is a good week. So thank you for all of you who enjoyed watching and listening to last week's program. Valentine Lowe, our old friend, dishing the dirt. And lovely stories. I'm still chuckling about the story about Dennis Thatcher. If you haven't seen the program, please check it out. Yes, was it Mrs. Thatcher discussing some mighty matter of royal government relations, and she wanted to hear the voice of the people, so she goes, Dennis, brings him in, gives him a large whiskey, probably a Lafroig, and here's his words of wisdom. Anyway, that's all good fun. So yeah, lots of people liked it. Svati Singh, hello Svati. You are a loyal listener, or you're a watcher. Either way, thank you very much for your lovely comment. This was great, says Svati, especially your intro. Thank you. I feel validated and vindicated. I agree with you. Forgiveness is an important part of life. Yeah, talking about Harry and William here. Let's hope those men can make that happen and keep other people on side too. I loved your interview, and I'm definitely going to watch you in Shauna. Saving that for my next tea break. And now with the cooler weather, my Scandal Mongers mug is finally getting a workout. Yes, I don't talk about the mugs very often. If you like the podcast, you must like and subscribe, please. That's always very helpful. Comment away. The more comments we get, the more activity we get in terms of the interest from the algorithms that make this recommended to other people. But if you thinking of Christmas coming, we have a shop. You can buy a couple of T-shirts and a range of silly mugs. I like this one, Scandal Mongers mugs with a few silly slogans on them, which are quite entertaining. And so please consider that for that special scandalous someone in your life, or maybe someone you'd like to get scandalous with. Ooh, naughty. So that's lovely. Thank you for reminding me of the mugs, Farty. Ralph7643. As an American, I find it appalling that a government body could tell a newspaper to retract a headline. Yes, that's one of the stories that Valentine tells about, I think it was something to do with the Queen. And there was a story about her being in favour of Brexit. This very divisive referendum we had. Oh, God, what is it now? 9 years ago nearly. Yeah, and the Royal said, no, she's totally apolitical, which is a proper constitutional position, of course. But as Valentine reveals in the interview, when it came to the referendum on Scottish independence, she did something quite naughty, and she did intervene in the political debate. Probably the only time, really, she's allowed herself to be used in a political campaign. She must have felt very strongly she did not want to see Scotland leave. Anyway, the Scottish nationalists were not happy about that. Marla Hole. Hello, Marla. I think you're new. Certainly new to the comment section, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Hi, Phil. Great conversation with Valentine Lowe. Interesting, clearly articulated. Looking forward to reading his book. I've got it on order here in Australia. Brilliant. That's what we want to see. If I sell books through this, I'll get more interesting authors to come and talk to me and talk to us. Oh, yeah, we mentioned the possibility of Harry making a documentary about Diana. Koalas are not bears, okay? Says, I wonder if Charles opened his meeting with Harry, or rather the half-wit prince, by asking him if he was going to make a film about his mother. That would be a good way to cut the meeting short. Indeed it would. Nice comments. I have loads of comments I want to talk about here. Half the jovial videos is your waffle. Keep waffling. Ignore the dissenters, says JM162. And finally, Caroline McGovern. Caroline, you've been on here a lot. Gave me a couple of quid as a little donation. Thank you for that. In all the upheaval here, it's lovely to have the balanced, reasoned voice of scandalmongers, and I'm really enjoying your book, 1945. Please don't stop your wee ramblings at the beginning. I so enjoy them, like coffee with a friend. Isn't that amazing? Like coffee with a friend. Yep, my work here is done. Actually, it's water, because otherwise it'll be cold by now, because I ramble on too much. So much happening. Epstein, revelations. I mean, scandals here, scandals there. Certainly in terms of British politics, my goodness. Since we last spoke, Peter Mandelson lost his job as ambassador in Washington because of his previously undisclosed friendship. I mean, people knew he'd been friends with Epstein, but all these emails that came out, they were cloying. I mean, really. Oleaginous is the word I think one might use. Smarmy, sucking up to this guy and talking about the deep friendship, even after he'd been convicted of some pretty heinous crimes. So that was the end of Mandelson. Mind you, he's been fired about 4 times, I think, in his career, so who knows, he might worm his way back. Then, of course, Fergie. This is all amazing for Andrew Loney's book. I bet he'll be adding chapter after chapter for the paperback. More Fergie scandal, yeah, Epstein as well. Amazing. Again, nobody knew really, or maybe it had been suspected, that she and Andrews, and certainly Heard, kept in touch with him and supported him many years after they claimed they'd finished with him. So that came out. That's got her in a lot of trouble. She's losing all of her remaining charity gigs. There's talk about Charles having to do something, to really make sure that she and Andrew are no longer allowed to any royal events, because he turned up recently at the Duchess of Kent's funeral. Andrew did. So that's still bubbling. Scandal drives the world. It was a good idea to choose a title like Scandalmongers when I started this with Andrew a few years ago. Starmer, our Prime Minister, came to power partly because there'd been a massive loss of faith in the Conservatives, the Tories as we call them, and that was driven by lots of scandals, financial scandals, donations, COVID rule breaking, a whole series of things. I mean, the Tory party kind of obviously fell apart. They're all at each other's throats as well. So Starmer came in, new broom, Mr. Integrity, former chief prosecutor. People thought he was boring, maybe a little bit robotic, but, stern and trustworthy, and maybe a bit of stability is what we needed. And oh my God, it's as bad as the Tories, guys. They've had so many ministers had to go, scandals to do with corruption and money and donations, just the same. It's the same kind of thing. And now a new one in terms of hiding money. But this is actually quite interesting. As I record this on Friday, the 26th of September, the story's still developing. But basically his main advisor ran a big lobby group that helped fund and support his rise to power, because there was a Labour leadership election for 2020. So, and they didn't declare as they're supposed to the donations, and it looks like that they knew that they were playing fast and loose with the rules, but they kind of sort of covered it up, or did they? I don't know. Will the police get involved? There's a suggestion they might. There's a powerful organisation here called the Electoral Commission, which looks into all this stuff. That's having a rethink whether they need to open an investigation. This could well damage the aide, Morgan McSweeney, but it could easily damage Starmer, because why did they hide these donations? I mean, there's lots of theories going around. Is it because they didn't want the rest of the Labour Party to know who was funding him? Suggestions that there's some powerful hedge funds involved. Maybe that wouldn't go down too well with the comrades on the left. And of course, the really dark side of this is that, don't forget, before that, Jeremy Corbyn had got the Labour Party into a terrible, terrible state, with a sort of open association with some really ugly and unpleasant and deeply anti-Semitic people and apologists for, if not actual practitioners of Islamist terror. And that really broke Labour in the sort of... I left the party over that issue myself after a famous panorama exposed much of it, although it was kind of open and obvious. Anyway, Starmer came in off the back of that. And maybe one of the reasons these donations were not revealed, people are sort of now hinting, is that some of them were from powerful figures in the Jewish community. Probably because they wanted the Labour Party back, they felt they could support. But again, if the party has a problem with anti-Semitism, maybe Morgan, McSweeney and Starmer were thinking, oh, we can't reveal this. But what a terrible, terrible situation for a party of the left to find itself in. So yeah, that's rumbling on. Scandals here, scandals there. Who knows where that's going? What else? Well, yes, Trump's been. I mean, 2 weeks. Can it really be 2 weeks? Trump was here for that royal visit, which it seemed to go very, very well. I mean, the royals were on their best behaviour, and I guess it shows you the value of a royal family. You know, it's kind of harder for politicians that they try to sort of sit there and look at their feet. They obviously don't like Trump. I mean, Charles and Trump could not be more different, but they did their job. They gave him an amazing trip. Lots of investment came from it. You might think it's cynical. You could say it's just pragmatic. It's just the way the world is. It's part of their job sometimes to hang out with people they don't like and give them a good time. They did. I have no problem with that at all, actually. It was quite interesting to see Trump on best behaviour. I mean, he was, you know what he's normally like. And obviously likes embarrassing people who are sitting next to him at press conferences, but he was on best behaviour when he came to Britain. And that's largely, I think, down to the royals flattering his massive planet-size ego. There you are. That's what happens. I think, oh, no, wait a minute. Somebody said we need to see more pictures. And I don't really know if you mean it, and I also don't really know how I find it, but I'm going to show you, because the other thing that happened was I went to the We Have Ways festival to talk about my book, 1945, The Reckoning. And this is a big kind of, like, I call it Glastonbury for military history nerds. It's full of men of roughly my age, some women, but I'd say 80% men, roughly my age. Many of them in red corduroy trousers reading the Daily Telegraph, who are really into military history. Actually, maybe that's the caricature. To be honest, they're old men, yeah, but some of them are younger. I mean, I think a lot of people in their 20s and 30s are getting into this military history thing, which is good for those of us who write books about it, of course. So can I actually find a way of sharing my screen so that I can show you? Okay, I always seem to click the wrong buttons. So no, it's not there. Is it maybe here under participants? No, that's not it. I'll go off and make a cup of tea. I will get there in the end. I will get there in the end. I will get there very soon. Oh, wait a minute. Here we go. Look at this. Look at this, guys. Sharing the screen. Yeah. So this is the big tent. Let me give you a nice view of this. That's a hospitality tent. All the writers are having cups of tea, and maybe things are a bit stronger. There's a big muddy field. It was not that muddy. It was a bit of a rainstorm at one point. And lots of people. Yeah, look, there are reenactors there. People camp. You know, it's like a festival. People bring their old military equipment to show it off, and their reconditioned jeeps and tanks, and the lectures. And there are, you know, people chatting away about, imagine you're at the beachhead at D-Day, this is what we're going to do. Oh yeah, a bit of mud. But yeah, absolutely fascinating, really. I mean, I was in my element. It's all run by the We Have Wade podcast, which is James Holland and Al Murray. Al Murray is a well-known British comedian. James is a well-known British author, who actually credits me in the foreword to my book. He credits me with inspiring him, which makes me feel rather proud and also rather old. So yeah, look, you can have old motorbikes, German parachute? That's a good 1940s joke. German parachute mine diffusing demo. That's the kind of way we want to spend our holidays, isn't it? Learning how to diffuse a mine. Yeah. Home guard. I sound embarrassing how much I enjoy this. I really did have a hoot. Because wherever you go, there are people who just want to talk to you about things that you know about and find interesting. They're live fire. They're actually firing those machine guns. That was fun. So let's just rush ahead. Look at this. Airfix models. It's like I used to do those when I was about 11, but there are lots of grown men who love making these model aircraft. And again, it's not exclusively the Second World War, but the Second World War just has that particular hold on us, especially in Britain. I think because it's so clearly the one great good war that we fought. Most other wars that Britain's been involved with, you could raise questions and challenges to. This one, really not so. And also, there's a sort of shared memories of national solidarity. That's very important, I think. And the fact that veterans are still just about with us, and people who were children at the time remember it very well. That was my getting ready for my speech. At this point, I was rather worried nobody would turn up, but look at that. I reckon there were about 300 by the end, perhaps 250. So that was really good fun. I did my talk. There they all are, lapping up every word. Some of them were clapping, I think. And then this happened, the life and times of an author. So I went to do my book signing, and there are all the authors, and I saw this dreaded word, book plates. Do you know what that means? That means they had none of my books to sell. That's right. I got in front of a big audience in a prestige event. And I got there and I said, well, where are the books? And he said, well, they only sent 5 and we sold those yesterday. So I had quite a big queue to want to buy my book. And all I could offer was these book plates, which if you don't know, they're like sticky bits of paper. You sign your name and they promise to buy it in future and stick it in. Well, yeah, of course, most of them probably won't, because that was the moment. And yeah, for some reason, apparently there was a breakdown in communications or some error, clerical error, computer error. My books didn't arrive. Well, 5 did, but I probably could have sold 100. So that was disappointing, if you're me. But still, to be honest, I had a great time. I'm lucky to be there. I spread the word. I talked to a lot of interesting people. Some of them will buy the book. Anyway, it's not about that. And I really shouldn't whinge, given that what I'm talking about are the experiences of people who, sacrificed like their lives, their health, So that's puts it all into perspective. But I thought it was quite amusing. Yeah, the life and times and travails of a struggling author. Okay, that's a lot, isn't it? I was going to read an extract. Somebody, I think it was Susan Mark. Hello, Susan. You've been on here a lot. Susan from Australia, I believe, said, I wouldn't mind hearing some more extracts from the book, maybe some of the funnier ones, because I did some quite serious stuff when I talked about it a month or two ago with Mock. And I don't want you to think it's all heavy politics. I mean, there is heavy politics, but there's lots of great characters, humour, love, loss, a certain amount of some naughty jokes, an amusing story about dysentery. Oh, yes, you don't get many of those. And lots of fun. So maybe next week or next couple of weeks, I will do an extract. Because, by the time we meet again, I'll be in Australia. So I haven't mentioned that yet. In the bio, there are links to my events. If you're in Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne, you can come see me. Most of them are either free or like $10. I think the one that costs $10 is the evening event in Sydney. And for that, you might even get a free drink. So I can't say fairer than that, can I? So yeah, I'll be in Australia. So I'll do the introduction to the next episode from Australia, probably in Perth, overlooking the Indian Ocean, which is something I'm looking forward to with childish glee. Right. Thank you for listening. Let's go and talk to Steve about Assassins and Templars, and I'll see you all at the other side. All the best. Hello, Steve. I see you've brought your advertising campaign behind you. All I have is bottles.
Well, you can't blame me for trying. Girls got to eat. So yeah.
Well, I've got my own copy of the book here. Look at
Oh,
this.
wonderful. Well done.
It's
That's
very
even
full
better.
in frame. You know, you're a fast worker. I didn't seem very long. We were talking about your Crusader book on this
Yeah.
very podcast.
Well, I do love it actually, but it's also, I've been reading and studying the Crusades for over 40 years, and I had to spend many years, making a different kind of living, working in finance and in the city, and it's yeah, so it's like a whole rush of joyful energy coming out.
Well,
So
it is.
yeah,
I mean, energy is a great word because if I was writing a review for your book, and I'd happily do that, I would say this is medieval history by Quentin Tarantino. I would
well,
I would say I'm often reminded of that famous Tarantino line, "We're going to get medieval on your ass,"
absolutely.
because there's an awful lot of that in this book.
That's there's a lot of torture in that. Yeah, no, absolutely. And but you can't. I think it's hard to write a boring book about the Assassins and the Templars. Obviously, I try, but they're just such big characters. I mean, what
Oh
can
no,
you
you've
say?
written a very entertaining, I'd say rollicking book,
Oh,
colourful,
oh,
exotic, violent. And it's also this part of history that I know you know an awful lot about it, but most people just think of it as kind of mysterious and intriguing. They don't know anything really about it, except maybe something to do with Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, this
yeah,
crazy
exactly.
world of medieval Middle East. It is kind of wild and crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that to me, that's the hilarious thing about it is we've constructed these huge legendary confections and we have our own conspiracy theories and Nazis on moon bases with Templars and all sorts of crazies, but you don't need that. They're crazy enough on their own. The history is fabulous and legend. They were legends in their own lifetimes anyway. So all I'm trying to do is bring those legends to the fore so that maybe it'll displace some of the conspiracy theories and people enjoy the real thing.
No, well, no, that's interesting you say that. I remember when we talked about Crusaders books, one of the things that stuck in my mind was you saying, you know, this was all before the Black Death. There are an awful lot of people around. There are a lot of young men all over the world with not a great deal to do. Big dreams, lots of testosterone,
Yep.
violence.
Yep.
And the Middle East is the kind of cockpit where they can kind of go and play out their kind of both personal ambitions and their sort of religious, spiritual kind of fantasies or,
Yeah.
jihad or, whatever fanatical thing you want to call it. And it
Yeah.
produces this amazing cocktail. Anyway, talking in generality, let's get into it. Let's
No,
start
no,
with
no.
let's start with the assassins.
Good
Because
man. Yes. Fine body of men.
very quickly, or as slowly as you like, really, who, why, where, what.
Okay, well, assassins. We, I think it's important that we're talking about assassins with an uppercase A, and that's not me being a sort of grammar pedant. It's very true. The assassins with an uppercase A were a sect within Islam, and they were a split from sort of broad stream Shiite Ismailism, which was in turn a split from on multiple levels from Shiism, which in turn was a split from uh, mainstream Islam. So it's split after split after split, and the guys were pretty much at the extreme end of that. They were what many of their so-called friends and neighbors would have they didn't have any friends. They were seen as heretics, even by other Ismailis, even the Fatimids in Egypt who they split off from. um, they got into trouble with, and they were murdering heads of the Fatimid Empire and so on. They they were so unpopular that they put themselves in the furthest flung parts of the region. So they started off really in, as we think of them, in Persia, in the mountains there, in Alamut, which is very famous, their original castle, I guess, and
What we're talking,
launched.
10,000 people, more than that.
We're talking. Well, it's interesting you say that. It's very difficult to find numbers, but I think there are two kind of sets of numbers that are important. One is the community, and the community would have been tens of thousands. So the people who were Nizari Ismailis, which is what they would have called themselves, they didn't call themselves assassins. That's a kind of a slur, really. So there's tens of thousands of them, but most of them are, bakers, peasants, lorry drivers or the equivalent. It's sort of, they're just a normal society, albeit, a very religiously focused one. but they have this tiny group within them called the Fideus. So their leadership, their master became known as the Old Man of the Mountain. He gathered a very small group of incredibly dedicated young men around him, and they became his killers. They were so committed they would happily die for their religion. And nowadays, if you see somebody talking about an assassin, they're nearly always talking about those committed young men, not the lorry drivers, taking food to and from places. So, but it's important to remember that the Fideus, I've never seen more than 13 of them in one place in a source. I suspect, and they were always in very short supply, which is one reason why they weren't a suicide squad. They were happy to die, but they didn't want to. They always tried to find an exit strategy. So on the one hand, I think you've got tens of thousands of devotees, but you've got the assassins within the assassins, with the Fideus, might only be a few tens. It might be maybe 100.
You give a really good kind of economic or rather demographic explanation as to why they started kind of pursuing their ambitions in this form of, dedicated, highly skilled assassins. Because basically, it's a tough neighborhood. There are not very many of them. Everybody else has got an army. So rather than fight in the field with a big army, which you don't have, you find a way to just kill off the key people in the enemy. And maybe that was the beginning of it, even without a religious component, though it seems to have had a religious component.
It's always been very religious. Yeah. I mean, what they were fighting for was their religion. They would say that they were an oppressed minority, an oppressed religion being persecuted. And that's absolutely right on one level. They were seen as heretics, so they were persecuted. But I think the big thing about it is that they did what they did because they had no choice. It's like being the smallest kid in the playground. You have to come up with a different strategy because the big kids are going to nick your lunch money. And you find that in the whole of the Crusades, all of the small players get kicked out pretty quickly. I mean, the Crusaders manage it for a couple hundred years, but only because Europe's continually sending supplies. All of the little Arab warlords were destroyed by their fellow Muslims very early on. The Nizari Ismailis, you would think, are the kind of least likely to succeed. In their high school handbook, they would be singled out as the sad losers, but they weren't, because they came up with this fabulous solution, which is, we haven't got millions of pounds, we can't buy an army. We haven't got 10,000 cavalry, but what we can do is leverage our love for our community, our commitment. And so they had these small number of highly skilled assassins who were able to project power in a way that nothing else could.
So you start the book with a great description of a really dramatic assassination they do. One of them dies, one of them escapes, of a Christian king. So at some point, I'm guessing that their fellow Muslims think, hang on a minute, we can use these people. We can hire them. Or were they always up for hire from the word go?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, in a way, it's odd that they're up for hire, because these are religious fanatics, and the people who hire them usually are Sunni Muslims, the people who hate them most. So it's not a natural relationship. And you would think that the assassins, they build this huge network of castles in the mountains. They're quite secretive. They're they want to be isolated. You'd think, wow, okay, guys, you've got your network. You just go up there and, pull the drawbridge up and Bob's your uncle. That's, you've saved your community and you've survived. The trouble is, I think the economics and politics always come into these things, and it's kind of like Tolkien. You look at woodland creatures and elves and stuff, and you think, how on earth, where do they make a living? What's the economic foundation of being a woodland creature? And I think it's pretty much like that with the assassins. We know how much it costs to build a castle because we've got some of the builders' invoices for Templar castles and for other Crusader castles, and it's horrendous. It's like aircraft carrier sort of money. And the assassins, as far as we can see, didn't have it because they were in fairly desolate areas that nobody else wanted to be and very difficult to get to. So the same reasons that made those mountains desirable as a fortification also made them very undesirable from an economic productivity. So you can't definitively prove it, but I'm pretty sure that they were always looking for ready cash. And And that, being a gun for hire was their main stock in trade. That was their USP, and that was what the assassin brand was all about.
There's a lot of kind of cruelty in the book, or performative executions and torture and the like. I mean, the very first, or maybe the most famous early assassin leader, this guy Hassan Sabar. Am I pronouncing
Yeah.
that correctly? Well, you should tell the story, but he's pretty cold, isn't he? Even to his own family.
Yeah. I mean, there's the levels of commitment and, yeah, what you would say extremism. I don't like words like terrorist or whatever because they're pejorative and they close down any sensible discussion. But he was clearly so committed to his cause. I mean, he found one of his sons having a glass of wine and had him executed for that. One of his other son was implicated in a plot. He was actually innocent, but Hassan had him executed for that as well. His wife was and the female members of the family were sent away. He never saw them again. And he actually stayed in his room. He never left his castle. He went up. There's a special treat. He went up onto the top of the tower twice, and I think it was 34 years. So this was a man who was incredibly aesthetic and fanatical and superbly focused, and a very good leader for his people. And I think he kind of set the tone. If you can imagine, what kind of character profile do you have to want to join that organization with those kind of leadership attributes, and there you have a blueprint for implacable people who are very difficult to deter.
Cool. Okay. Well, there's the assassins. Now let's move to the Templars. Another pen portrait, if you like. I mean, they seem to be the sort of like they started out. It would seem from the way you tell the stories, the sort of the more modern fighting arm of the Crusaders. They work out ways of new techniques to beat the Turks and the Muslim armies, and they're kind of heroes at first. Is that fair? No, maybe you should tell the story.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Templars. The funny thing is, I mean, and the reason why I wrote the book was having studied the Assassins and the Templars separately, and having seen them play out their roles in the video games, Assassin's Creed and things like that, where you think, wow, well, that's all fantasy. But actually, there is a natural kind of strategic conjoining of them, and they bounce off each other for 200 years. The Templars, although they're very different and would probably never recognize it, were actually very similar in a lot of ways. They were hugely outnumbered and surrounded like the assassins were, and unpopular with a lot of their Sunni neighbors, as you can imagine. And they were always incredibly few in number. When the most famous Templar charge that was really successful was at the Battle of Mongers, where they nearly killed Saladin, managed to break through to within a couple of meters of him before he ran away. And there were 84 Templars there. That was all their main guys that they could pull in for the day. There were 84 men. When the last big Templar charge took place in Acre, in 1291, when the Crusader states were finally destroyed, it was probably no more than a dozen knights that led a charge against hundreds, possibly thousands of the enemy. So they were always, they're like the assassin fideis. They're so committed, and they've worked out that they can bring the promise of death in a same but different way. So with an assassin, they're implacable and you'll get a knife in the back. With the Templars, they're implacable and you get a lance in your face. They're different but similar simultaneously.
Well, of course, religious fanaticism, what today we might say motivates a suicide bomber, wasn't uncommon in the Christian world at all at that time, and they seem to have had some of the chants you have. They say, Christ is our leader, death will be our reward.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think it is important to say that you would think these guys are suicide bombers, Templars and assassins. In fact, they're not, and it's very important to them that they're not. For the assassins, it's a very, very practical thing. There aren't many of them. The last thing they want is I think one of the teams, the first team that tried to get Saladin, I think some of the sources say 13 guys, and that's the biggest fideis team I can think of offhand. They always had a plan with a way out. So their guys tried to escape, and they were such a scarce commodity that they were needed back home. It's like aircraft carriers. You send them into battle. You don't want to lose them. You want them to do their job. They may be lost, but you don't do it deliberately. And the same with the Templars. It's a fine theological distinction, but it's a very, very real one, where they saw fighting in defense of their community as an act of love, in the same way as the Crusades, in the broadest sense, theologically, is an act of love because it's a pilgrimage in defense of the Christians of the Middle East. It's a defensive thing. If you stray from that, a Templar would instantly go to hell if he deliberately committed suicide. These were all devout Catholics. Suicide, very much not something you do. So motivation was everything. If you go into battle and die because you enjoy killing people, that's a very bad thing. But if you die with love in your heart in defense of your fellow man, then that's literally an elevator to God. So it's a very binary thing, but very important.
What kind of men became Templars, and what made them so good, at least in their first century or so?
Yeah, I think they always were really good fighters. I mean, there weren't ever that many of them. I think part of the issue is that if you think of a Templar army, a big Templar army might have 1,000 men. It still probably only had 50 brother knights. And when we talk about Templars, we're thinking about the brother knights in the same way as when you talk about assassins, you're thinking about the fideis. They came, funnily enough, they didn't come from the highest ranks of the nobility, because if you think about it, it's kind of logical. It's an attractive proposition on one level, to become a Templar. It's a bit of a James Bond thing, women want you, men want to be you, that kind of thing. But there are a couple, and you're a very young man and you're quite pious. But there's some obvious downsides. Your life expectancy is tiny. It's like being an officer in the First World War. I mean, the guys were just going down the whole time. And the other thing is you're celibate. So you're a professed religious, you're a member of a religious order, you're celibate. There's a lot of things that are unattractive for a teenage boy, and particularly for the high members of the nobility, that they like their boys to go off and have kids. So because obviously you're talking about that's the way that land and power goes down the generations. So you find it's kind of either the middling knights or other sons of the nobility that might go into it, because that way there's huge honor, and because you're genuinely pious, you get it reflects very well on your chances in heaven, and helps your family because they'll get remission of sins for helping and so on. So there's a lot of virtues, but
are they from all over Europe, or are they mostly born in that region, from Christian communities in that region?
The Templars were mostly born in Europe. Obviously, the Crusader states tended over time to become more and more guys who were settlers who were born over there. And you have to remember, most of the population of the Holy Land was still Christian then. I mean, the Middle East was Christian before the Muslim invasions. So, and in the 12th century, the majority of the Holy Land was still Christian. So it wasn't a kind of stark invasion from Europe into the Middle East. It was Europe helping Christians in the Middle East. But a lot of the guys, say you would be born in France or actually, I used to live in Ledbury on the Welsh borders, and one of our big local guys ended up running the Templar armies in Tripoli. He almost certainly had contact with the assassins. So you get these guys, it's almost like science fiction, really. They're taken from very quiet places. I'm not saying the Welsh marches were quiet in the 12th century either, but you could be taken from Clerkenwell or whatever and whisked off into this very different, very dangerous place. And if malaria or if typhoid didn't get you in the first month, sort of an arrow in the back of the neck probably would. It's a very edgy thing to do.
So both you sort of tell the story of the rise and fall of both these communities in the book, and they're both in a key player in all of that is this, perhaps the most famous person from the whole of the Crusades, Saladin, who is actually quite an important character in the book. And I learned a lot about him I didn't know, actually, actually that he actually kind of dies in his bed. He's one of the few people in this book who doesn't end up with his head on a stick.
Yeah, he's very much like a Napoleonic general. You know what Napoleon said, I don't care if they're clever, just I want lucky generals. And Saladin was incredibly lucky. I mean, I think the assassins, we know that they had at least two goes at him. And these are the most dangerous people on the planet, really. I think up to five goes at him. And they threw everything they could, and he survived. The Templars got to within a couple of meters of him, but he ran off, survived. He had at least two very major illnesses that nearly killed him in an age when medical healthcare was minimal. He and then he died just after the third crusade. So it was like all his luck held until he didn't need it, and then he left.
Amazing story. I mean, where was, because for people who don't know, and I certainly didn't know much of the background until I read the book, where was his power base, Saladin? Where does he emerge from? Because he kind of really, he kind of beats the Christians in a big set piece battle. I think the Templars get hammered and lots of them get executed. And then that triggers Richard the Lionheart and the sort of final act of it all, which is so interesting. But what's his backstory?
Yeah, it's not what you think. I mean, I'm not a huge fan. I'm an admirer, of what he did for his people, because he was clearly, good general, good politician. People liked him. I don't. He also had a very professional and effective PR machine, which has created this idea of chivalry and has created this kind of aura around him. And it was deliberate. I mean, fair dues to the guy. He knew what he was doing. He was basically, he wasn't an Arab or a Turk. He was a Kurd, so he was a foreigner in the region, same as the Turks were. And he was the nephew of a general of one of the big Turkish warlords, a guy called Nur al-Din. So he was potentially not a major character at all. And his uncle managed to persuade Nur al-Din to lend him an army, and he'd go off and try and conquer Egypt for Nur al-Din and create a big empire, which he did, bizarrely. I mean, he was very good. And then, lucky Saladin, his uncle dies within a few weeks of his huge victory, and Saladin finds himself suddenly master of Egypt, which is the richest country. It's an entire empire in its own right. It's the richest empire in the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so his boss, Nur al-Din, says, "Oh, great, that's really good, Saladin. Yeah, can we start seeing some of the checks? Direct debits will be fine." So he keeps asking for all this cash. And Saladin's always too busy to send it, strangely. And it almost comes to blows. Nur al-Din goes down and arranges to have a meeting with Saladin to ask him what's going on. I mean, basically, everybody knows what's going on. He's happy spending the money, doesn't want to send it on. And Nur al-Din dies. Before it can turn nasty, Nur al-Din dies. So then Saladin has all the cash from Egypt, and he just goes and destroys all the other Muslim powers in the region. So he manages to create this fabulous empire from Egypt and Yemen, but right up into Mesopotamia, Syria, and so on. So he was a clever guy, but he was in the right place at the right time, and he was lucky. But the obvious sort of part of that story is he's a usurper. He's basically a chancellor who's done very well. So he spends the rest of his life trying to show the world that he's actually, really the good guy, and that he's the one leading the fight against, the heretics like the assassins or the infidels like the Crusaders. Even though he spends about 90% of his career attacking other Muslims, he says, "Oh, well, yeah, I had to do that because if I took over their town, I could use their resources to kill the assassins or the Crusaders." And he has I don't know. I genuinely don't know where the idea of Saladin, the chivalrous person, comes from. He habitually used to murder prisoners of war.
Yeah, well, he's not very chivalrous to the poor old Templars when he finally beats them, is he?
No, he's not at all. I mean, it is partly a backhanded compliment. It's a kind of compliment you don't want to have, as in, I'm going to take you outside and cut your head off because I don't want you coming back for a second shot. So, yeah, I mean, he was habitually murdering prisoners. Richard the Lionheart gets a lot of stick because he did kill some prisoners of war when negotiations broke down, but he did that probably 15 years plus after Saladin had already started habitually murdering prisoners. But Saladin's behavior has been forgotten by history, and Richard's has been kind of expanded for reasons I don't quite understand.
Well, I want to get onto the legacies and the computer games and all that stuff and the crazy ideas about, lost arks of the Covenant. But before that, we should bring the stories to a conclusion. How do both of these powers fall? Because they
Yeah,
both do, don't they?
they do. I mean, and it's
After a
an
couple of
extra.
hundred years. I mean, they're quite
Yeah,
successful, but then inevitably.
absolutely. I mean, you can say it is that classic thing. Everything comes to an end. So are we winners? Well, we're all going to die. So we're all going to be losers ultimately. No one comes out alive. And that was true of the Assassins and the Templars. They both came into the Eastern Mediterranean at about the same time. They both appeared sort of end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th, and they both survived until the second half of the 13th century. So you might say, if you're a cricketing fan, good innings. I mean, they actually, given their resources and the tiny numbers of guys we're talking about, good innings is a summary, I think. The assassins kind of met their match. Yeah, the assassins in Iran made the mistake. The Mongols kind of emerged from the steppes in the 1250s, and they were potentially, I mean, the assassins thought they might be friends because they just ran through the area killing everybody they could, which was primarily Sunni Muslims. So from an assassin's perspective, they initially thought, wow, this is great. And these people are killing us Sunni Muslims. They can't be all bad. So they tried to cozy up to them and got rebuffed, as inevitably, because the assassins don't have friends, but the Mongols don't have friends either. They have people who they need to submit to them. And the assassins did what they did. They did what they knew, which was they killed the next Mongol general who came along. And the trouble was they were used to doing that with fairly small families of warlords, and they would fold when you did that. If you do that to the Mongols, you're just irritating them. You just wind them up. So the Mongols go mental at that point, and they just absolutely destroyed the assassins in Iran. The assassins in Syria, which are the ones the book mostly talks about, the Old Man of the Mountain, it's pretty much where the Assassin's Creed game comes in, is sort of better off because there's a force from Egypt and Syria called the Mamluks, who are these kind of slave warriors who take over from effectively Saladin's empire, and they destroy the Mongols at a battle called Anjalut in 1260. So I'm sure the assassins went, wow, big sigh of relief. Thank God, now we're back. Things are back to normal. But in fact, the Mamluks were even worse. They were just as implacable, and they were so well resourced. They just had massive armies, and they basically just swatted the assassins away. That's really coming back to your earlier point. Why would an assassin take money? And by the 1260s, the answer to that was not just that they were poor, but it was that they had to. They were kind of doing it for their own survival. And the Mamluks, in particular, Sultan Baybars, who was incredibly ruthless, very, very good general, massively ruthless, basically, treated them as his creatures. He hated their guts. We've got some of his correspondence. We know what he really thought about them, but he would just send them in the most horrible way, actually, to kill people. He would put them into treaties and negotiations, and there'd be a little stipulation in the treaty saying, we're now at peace, but I may send my assassins to kill you in the same way as I killed your husband. It's very, it's what you might see in certain parts of the world now when you get, generals and governments taking over quite ruthless regimes. And the assassins there just became little puppets. And it was like kind of evil puppets you send off to do a killing. And they, in fairness to them, they survived. They managed to save their community. So the promise of death was still working for them, but on a very neutered basis.
Interesting.
And the Templars had the same thing.
The Templars are taken out really by a Western Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they get hammered by Saladin, but the survivors, I mean, I know it's not a quick process, but they fall foul of is it the French king?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it's over, you're absolutely right. And it's over 100 years later. So they do drag it out. Yeah, they were
Is that
they
about
were
money?
unlucky.
Is that about money?
Money, superstition, greed, nastiness. Yeah, I mean, basically, the French monarchy needed money, owed them money. They were also redundant. they had one job, that was to defend the Holy Land, and they'd failed. The Holy Land had collapsed. So fairly soon after the Crusades had ended, they were this kind of inflexible, arrogant organization that made the mistake of, lending money to the king, having lots of land. So the French king just piled in and arrested them, and they were eventually dissolved. But the wonderful thing in terms of the legends is that to bring them down, he just accused them of the most crazy things, magic, sorcery, Satanism, worshipping heads, I mean, absolutely mental stuff. But it's just like Goebbels, you just tell a big lie, you chuck enough mud, some of it sticks. Yeah, and they were completely innocent.
It's weird, isn't it? Because the echoes, I have heard the echoes of that French king hundreds of years later in the offices of television production companies and commissioning editors. And I've worked a bit in archaeology, on TV archaeology, not the Graham Hancock stuff, but hopefully respectable documentaries about archaeology. But at some point, the commissioning editor always says, "Do you know what we'd love? Something on the Holy Grail or the secret treasures that we know the Templars have hidden away somewhere." Surely they do, don't they? And that is still in the popular imagination, I think.
I know. I mean,
so is there anything in it at all? Is there even a tiniest grade of truth in that?
There are enough elements that are true to create a conspiracy. But, so basically, short answer, no, it's not true. Short answer, there are components. People at the time did believe there were holy grails. The Templars did have a base on the, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. They were good at seafaring. They did sort of invent merchant banking because they had to transfer funds to these. So there's a lot of capabilities. Ultimately, it's all just kind of a joke, really, though. I mean, there's no evidence that they had the Holy Grail or anything like it. Even the conspiracies now, Rosslyn Chapel, which is beautiful, it's supposed to have links with the Templars, connections to the Holy Grail, and it wasn't built until the Templars had been gone for 150 years before the builders sent the first invoice in. And it's all a lovely story, but I think it always says more about us than it does about them. And the assassins too. There's something in us who love the idea of somebody, Jason Bourne, who's totally focused, unstoppable, implacable, partly because we're all sad little creatures and, they're so unlike us, but we kind of get this frisson of being a spectator, but kind of voyeur on this aspect of human nature.
Well, actually, there's a little bit of this in your book, I think. That's why it's appealing, because there is a sort of magic to this stuff. The cleverness, the scheming, and then suddenly the dagger in the back, and then they've gone. Where have they gone? They've disappeared, like that. It's just magical, and yeah, I guess almost supernatural.
Yeah, but it isn't.
but that's also, of course, I'm not a gamer. I haven't played a computer game since they were like that.
Good.
But I know it's a massive subculture. And
Yes.
I know that Assassin's Creed is one of the all-time great.
Yes.
But what I didn't know until I read your book is that actually that came out of sort of the post 9/11 world, and very explicitly influenced by Ridley Scott, you'll tell the story, I'm sure, was an attempt to kind of diffuse some of the sort of stereotypes, hatred of that moment, which I found it quite remarkable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think Assassin's Creed ultimately it's not a history lecture. So I would never criticize them for being something that they don't pretend to be at all. And in the same way as Ridley Scott and Kingdom of Heaven, it's a lot of historians don't like it. I personally think it's great. I love it, and it looks beautiful. And you just have to remember it's not a history lecture. It isn't
So
right.
Ridley Scott makes Kingdom of Heaven, which is kind of about Saladin and his world.
Yeah.
And then, inspired by that, because it tries to take a fairly moderate position, the makers of this hugely successful game come along. And the central character is a Templar, isn't he?
Yeah, well, yeah, an assassin, really. I mean, in fairness to Assassin's Creed, it's not just on the film. I think the film is a big influence, and they would recognize that. But there's also a book, quite an old book called Alamut, I think, which looks at other things. There are many influences, but that Kingdom of Heaven was one that certainly resonated with me. And you do find in the film And in the game, there are a lot of real historical characters, not definitively acting true to type, but certainly interacting. So in the video game, you get Robert de Sablé, who's a Anglo-French sort of Templar, who's also Richard the Lionheart's admiral. This is all true. Who'd left his lands mainly in France to come and join Richard, and because the Templars wanted to keep as much influence as possible, they said to Robert de Sablé, "Wow, why don't you become master of the order?" And so he did. So this guy, who was an admiral, a diplomat, really really tough bloke, became master of the Templars just to bind Richard the Lionheart in with them even more closely. And he is a big character in Assassin's Creed, and you find that the assassins are playing a kind of more morally neutral aspect to it. And I think that reflects a lot of what's happening in the West, over the last 20 years, is this whole questioning about, are we the good guys, and this kind of moral ambivalence and a lot of self-flagellation that's been going on. And the game sort of reflects that, because there is no, it's all grey. There's no good or bad. You find out that Sinan, who's the old man of the mountain, is actually a secret Templar. You find that these groups are operating through time, and that none of them really stand for what you think they stand for. It's a game and an existence of moral ambivalence, and I think that's one thing that is very fashionable and appeals to people a lot.
That's so interesting. I mean, you do just say that, but in their own ways, both of these groups have a slightly kind of dark reputation, but you say they're also, in their own way, honest and brave. I think those are the words you use in your final chapter.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm a very boring person who, looks both ways before I cross the road. And I always admire people who, are bold and do all the things that, I don't do, because I've got insurance policies and mortgages and things. So I think there's an element of admiration there. There's not that I want to go on holiday with any of them, because they're clearly very, very dangerous people. But I think they would both genuinely say they were fighting for their cause and for their people. They weren't, the assassins by and large weren't murdering people gratuitously, and they would argue that they killed far less people than Saladin, say. Saladin murdered tens of thousands of people. The assassins, you can, during that period, there were maybe half a dozen people that they had murdered. Their means of developing their brand, which is the promise of death, was much more clinical. And similarly with the Templar charge, it was sort of clinical. You identified the standard where Saladin or whoever is, and you just launch yourself at it, and you're almost unstoppable. So it's not about butchering 10,000 men. It's trying to get to the one man that matters. And that's a fundamental truth of the brand behind both groups, really.
That's so interesting. Okay, so final question. I'm sure everybody must ask you this. If you have to choose to be one or the other, which is it?
No one's asked me that. Fantastic. Gosh, good question. Gosh, I have to say I'm fundamentally unsuited to either. I was.
Well, you get the idea that the Templars are all kind of 6'7" and hugely big men. Not saying you're not a big man, but maybe you're
huge. Yes,
you're suited more to kind of sneaking in with the dagger. I'm not saying.
No, I think they could put me in their pocket. I'm definitely not the Templar mold, and I did for my sins have to go to school in a monastery, so I don't have any illusions about monks either. So, but on the other hand, I can't really relate too much with the guys like Hassan and that kind of whole aesthetic, super ferocious approach to life. So I'd say I admire them both from a distance, but I won't be volunteering for either.
Brilliant. Well, you've brought their will to life so very well. Like I say, Quentin Tarantino should be optioning this book.
Good. Put it out. Thank you for putting it out there, Phil. Very kind.
I'll drop him a line tomorrow. All the best, Stephen. Good luck with it.
You too. Take care, old thing.
Bye. You can't say you don't get good value for this podcast. My holiday snaps, amusing anecdotes from my life, my various travails, disasters, occasional triumphs, and people like Steve coming on to talk about amazing things and amazing worlds that he wants to share with us. I really enjoyed that conversation, as I'm sure you could tell. Yeah, talking of people I've become friends with through doing the podcast. Next week, no, next not week, next fortnight when I'm in Australia. Did I mention I'm going to Australia? Yes, when I'm in Australia in 2 weeks' time. The interview I will be including in the show is with Roger Morehouse. He's written a really good new book all about U-boats. Yes, back to World War II, and why not? Roger's become a mate, partly through the podcast, partly because we've met on the circuit. You know, people who write books and like to sit and have garrulous, slightly drunken evenings talking about their work. And I've met him at a few of those. And yeah, he's become a good mate, as has his chum, Antonia Senior. And they have a podcast, actually, which you should check out. History Buffs, they're called the History Buffs, and they do a kind of book review show on here. Yeah, so Roger's book on U-boats, which is interesting because he's a German speaker, and this is entirely from the German perspective. If you remember a few weeks ago, months ago now, we talked to Victoria Taylor. She's done a book about the Luftwaffe entirely through the German perspective. So it's about the Battle of Britain from the enemy point of view, and he's doing the same with U-boats. I think it's really interesting because these are all kind of classic British hero stories, but you get a much more complete impression of them if you can see them from the enemy's point of view. And it's also more original. I actually wrote a book review of Roger's book, and I called it Sympathy for the Devil, because it's hard to read it without feeling some sympathy for these young men in these submarines who had horrific loss rates, and the casualty rates were sky high. And yet they were Nazis, they were the bad guys. I'm glad they were defeated, of course I am. But learning about their world is fascinating if you're into this stuff, and indeed I am. So yeah, Roger will be joining me in 2 weeks' time, and I'll be speaking to you probably from the shores of the Indian Ocean, as I mentioned. I'll be staying in Fremantle for a couple of nights at the beginning of my trip to Australia. A place I know, a place I've worked, seeing lots of mates there. So yeah, what a great combination of bit of book promotion, makes it tax deductible, I hope. Because I am genuinely doing a little bit of work there, but also seeing a lot of my old Australian friends in various places. So that's good for Phil. Thank you for your company once again. I really enjoy these shows, and it's lovely that you engage with me, that you respond and comment. Please keep that up. And I hope to see you all again from another corner of the planet. Actually, there is one thing I just remembered when I talked in the introduction. For those vanishingly few of you who are still here at the end, I mentioned the scandal with Starmer. And one thing that occurred to me, and I don't think I've seen this written anywhere else, is that all of this stuff came out about the donations in the days after Peter Mandelson lost his job in Washington. Now, Mandelson has not spoken himself about any of this, nor has he spoken in public much about him being fired for his Epstein friendship, but he's let it be known through various friends that he's furious. He's absolutely livid. He thinks he told Starmer and the Labour Party everything, that none of it should have been a surprise, and they appointed him anyway because he's good at his job, which is basically kind of sucking up to people. You know, apparently he's great company, good, fun, gossipy kind of a diplomat, and he had some success with Trump and Vance and that crowd. And he apparently feels that he's been very hard done by. Now, if you remember, this is about donations. This guy McSweeney had access to powerful people who were giving the Labour Party money, which he was using to help Starmer become leader and subsequently the Prime Minister. So it's a big moment. Who in the Labour movement has great connections to lots and lots of wealthy people? I'll tell you who, Peter Mandelson. And I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if this isn't Mandelson's way of getting back at Starmer. He is putting these stories out. Is he? I don't know. I have absolutely no evidence for this, but the timing is very, very suspicious. He loses his job. Suddenly these stories now are all over the press about dodgy dealings and dodgy donations and cover-ups. And yeah, I wonder. For those with long memories, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he had a massive fallout with Dominic Cummings, who was his kind of, I don't know what you call him. I mean, someone said he was like his Svengali figure. Certainly he was his top advisor. They had a massive fallout. And not long afterwards, all these stories came out about what was happening in Downing Street during the COVID social distancing regulations. So I mean, a lot of people think Cummings put the knife into Johnson. Is Mandelson now putting the knife into Starmer? I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to speculate about if your business is scandal. So yeah, there you are. Final bit of scandal to leave you something to think about. I'll see you all in a couple of weeks from the other side of the world. Can't wait. Take care. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.